distinguished guests, colleagues, and fellow innovators. It's an honor to address you today at Strategies in Satellite Ground Segment 2025. We come together at a key moment for space industry. The space sector is experiencing unprecedented growth and transformation, a new space era fueled by thousands of new satellites, game-changing technologies, and an explosion of demand for connectivity. The ground segment, our teleports, ground stations, data centers, networks on Earth, is a critical backbone enabling all these space-based innovations. Today, I want to offer a global perspective on how we can build tomorrow today by updating outdated frameworks, embracing standardization, ensure equitable access, managing spectrum wisely, integrating non-terrestrial networks, exploring new frequency bands, managing spectrum, as I said, strengthening security, and paving a sustainable path forward, including effective space traffic management. I speak to you as a fellow who had witnessed our industry challenges and triumphs, and as someone passionately convinced that the decision we make now will shape a more innovative, inclusive, and secure space-enabled future. The regulatory and legal frameworks governing space and satellite communications are struggling to keep pace with rapid innovation. Many of the rules we operate were crafted in a different era and now risk becoming outdated constraints. For instance, key principles of international space law were established in 1967 Outer Space Treaty at the height of the Cold War. While the OST declared space the province of all humankind and prohibited national appropriation of celestial bodies, it did not foresee the rise of a commercial space industry. Today, the explosion of private satellites and mega-constellations exposes gaps in the state-centric framework. States are responsible for supervising private space activities under Article 6 of the OST, but in practice, this model is struggling. How do governments effectively oversee thousands of satellites launched by companies across the globe? Modern challenges like satellite mega-constellations, resource mining, orbital debris, commercial human spaceflights were simply not envisioned by those early treaties. We see a similar lag in regulatory regimes for satellite communications. The sharing rules that govern how satellites coexist in key frequency bands, for example, power limits to protect geostationary satellites from interference by non-GSO constellations, were developed in the 90s. Encouraging, regulators are responding. A new rulemaking is underway. The goal is to remove outdated technical barriers that limit performance and update sharing frameworks to reflect today's interference environment and satellite capabilities. This is a critical step to uncap the potential of modern constellations for faster, more competitive services. At the international level, the ITU World Radio Communication Conference plays a vital role in updating the global radio regulators, essentially the rulebook for spectrum and orbit use. As we update rules, we must also update how our technologies interoperate. The satellite ground segment has historically been fragmented, proprietary system, custom interfaces, and little standardization. That is changing rapidly out of necessity. Digital transformation and network convergence demand that ground segment equipment and networks speak the same language. Similarly, consider the convergence of satellite and terrestrial telecom networks. Standardization in this context ensures that space-based and terrestrial networks interwork smoothly, expanding coverage and capabilities for end users. It also allows satellite operators to tap into massive mobile device ecosystem and vice versa. Telecom operators can integrate satellite components into their offerings. We already see initial direct-to-device messaging and IoT via satellite, and more is coming. Standardization makes this technically feasible. It is now up to us to implement and capitalize on these standards. Even as we innovate, we must keep our eyes on the core mission: connecting the unconnected and ensuring space benefits for all humankind. Today, around 2.6 billion people, 1/3 of humanity, still lack reliable internet access. Many live in the global south or in remote rural areas where terrestrial infrastructure is sparse. Satellite communications are uniquely positioned to close this gap. We need satellites to address the digital divide across the global south and in rural and remote areas of developed countries. Our increasing space industry is not just about commercial opportunity. It is about extending connectivity to everyone and making digital transformation truly inclusive. Equitable access also resonates with the ideals of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Digital connectivity underpins progress on a majority of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, from equality, quality education to economic growth. By bringing internet and communication services to underserved populations, satellite networks become an enabler of social and economic development, whether it's connecting schools in rural Africa, enabling telemedicine in isolated communities, or supporting smart agriculture in developing countries. However, equitable access is not guaranteed. It requires conscious effort in policy and business strategy. Spectrum allocation is one area where equity matters, and I will address spectrum in a moment. Another aspect is affordability and inclusion. We must continue driving costs down through new technologies, economies of scale in manufacturing, and innovative business models, so that satellite services are affordable to those who need them the most. Importantly, equitable access is also about fair opportunity for nations to participate in the space economy. Not every country can launch satellites, but through multilateral efforts like regional satellite programs or sharing of ground resources and knowledge transfer, we can avoid a scenario where only a few nations reap the benefits of the space boom. The principle that space is the province of all humankind must translate into concrete actions today in how we allocate resources, share data, and extend services beyond profitable urban markets. Our strategies in the ground segment should align for this. For example, by developing gateways and ground stations in underserved regions, training local talents, and working with international development agencies. If satellites are to deliver on these promises, they need reliable access to radio frequency spectrum, the invisible highways that carry all our signals. Spectrum is the lifeblood of satellite communications, but is a finite, increasingly contested resource. Practically every space service, whether communication, Earth observation, navigation, or science, depends on specific frequency bands that must be free of harmful interference. At the same time, terrestrial wireless services are also hungry for spectrum. We recall the past battles over the C-band spectrum between satellite operators and mobile operators. The primary venue for global spectrum management is, of course, the International Telecommunication Union, which for 60 years has allocated frequency and orbital slots to avoid interference and ensure each nation can access the spectrum it needs. The ITU radio regulations, a global treaty, govern these allocations, and the World Radio Communication Conference updates them on a 4-year cycle. This process is crucial for keeping rules in sync with technologies. However, the complexity of coordination is growing. Some bands have historically been shared by GSO and NGSO satellites under fixed power limits, but these old sharing criteria are now under review because NGSO constellations have proliferated beyond what was imagined. Initiatives to revisit NGSO power limits that no longer reflect today's realities attempt to adapt spectrum policy to current needs. The aim is to see if modern satellites can coexist with GSO neighbors under updated, possibly more flexible interference criteria. We should all follow and inform these debates. There's also the push to identify new spectrum for expansion, such as portion of the K-band and even optical laser communication outside the traditional radio spectrum. Another dimension is equitable spectrum access for nations, as I've been talking already about that. I've touched on this throughout, but let me crystallize. Global coordination and enlightened regulations are prerequisites for everything we do in space. Space is inherently international. Satellites fly over all countries, and radio waves ignore borders. So no single nation can go alone. We rely on bodies like the ITU, UN COPUOS, and national regulators working in concert to create an enabling environment. The International Telecommunication Union, as mentioned, has been at the forefront of connecting the world with respect to management. Moving forwards, ITU will have to deal with even tougher questions. How to incorporate novel systems into radio regulations, how to improve procedures for new entrants, for instance, small SAT filling procedures, and importantly, how to enforce rules in an era when breaking them, say not coordinating or causing interference, could be tempting to some actors. That ties into space traffic management, which will I address shortly. On the broader policy side, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is where nations discuss space governance beyond the spectrum, topics like long-term sustainability, norms of behavior, and yes, space traffic coordination. Under COPUOS, voluntary guidelines for space sustainability were agreed, best practices to mitigate debris. There is a talk now on moving towards more concrete international frameworks, including potentially on space traffic management, essentially rules of the road for all the actors. This is still in early stages and consensus is hard, but the conversation is happening. STM is on the agenda of COPUOS Legal Subcommittee annually now. We need to keep engaging with the UN discussions because they set the high-level principles that can eventually shape binding rules. For instance, ensuring equitable access, which we discussed, might become a formal principle in future space government agreements, and that could influence how spectrum orbits are allocated or how mega-constellations are approved globally. National regulators, on the other hand, implement these international rules and add their own on top. Close cooperation between national regulators and industry is vital to avoid regulatory bottlenecks. It's worth noting that sometimes national decisions can outpace international ones, for better or worse. We want regulators to be forward-leaning, but also remain aligned with international frameworks to prevent harmful interference or conflicts. In summary, we must actively engage at all regulatory levels. As we build out this advanced system, we face some truth. Space infrastructure, including its ground segment, has become a target for cyber attacks and other security threats. Satellite communications today underpin critical services, military networks, emergency communications, power grid monitoring, financial transactions, and more. This makes them attractive targets for adversaries in geopolitics and in cyber warfare. The recent example of Viasat underscores several points. First, cybersecurity in the satellite domain can no longer be an afterthought. It must be integral to system design and operations. We need robust encryption of command links, authentication for ground station access, network segmentation, and regular security audits. Second, information sharing is critical. Operators should collaborate through forums, for instance, like the Space ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, to exchange threat intelligence and jointly defend against attacks. Thirdly, supply chain security. Many satellite networks rely on third-party software and hardware. Ensuring these are free from backdoors or vulnerabilities is essential. It's worth noting that beyond cyber, jamming and interference attacks are also on the rise. Additionally, physical security on the ground sites shouldn't be ignored. Teleports and data centers might need protection against intrusions and sabotage given their importance. On the policy side, currently there is no binding international regime specifically for cybersecurity in space, and the rules of engagement for state-sponsored cyber attacks in space are murky. This is an area crying out for clearer norms and potentially agreements. Akin to know, we have rules against certain attacks on critical infrastructure on Earth. Lastly, I would like to address the challenge that might seem a step removed from ground segment, but the reality is closer linked: space traffic management, or broadly, the sustainable management of orbital environment. We are launching more satellites than ever before. The result is that key orbits, especially lower Earth orbits, are becoming crowded and increasingly risky. Each satellite we operate must now perform frequent maneuvers to avoid potential collisions, as the probability of conjunctions has skyrocketed with mega constellations. Every maneuver consumes propellant and shortens the satellite life, not to mention the complexity when multiple operators have to coordinate who moves first, in a collision avoidance scenario. Meanwhile, spent satellites and debris accumulate, posing long-term hazards like the Kessler syndrome, we all know, that we cannot ignore any longer. In short, we are approaching a tipping point for space traffic safety. Without intervention, we risk rendering some orbits unusable for future generations, which would be a tragedy and a loss of enormous economic potential. Why is this relevant to the ground segment? Because tracking objects, sharing data, and executing maneuvers all rely on ground infrastructure and coordination protocols. Many companies and agencies have deployed ground-based radars, telescopes, and space surveillance systems to monitor satellites and debris. Integrating this into a cooperative network where operators can get timely space situational awareness data is part of STM. For instance, if my ground control system receives an alert that one of my satellites has a high probability of collision, I need reliable data to act on and possibly communication channels to negotiate with other operators involved. Currently, much of this is done via ad hoc email exchanges and trust. Developing an STM space traffic management framework is fundamentally a governance challenge, more than a technical one. We have the basic technologies to track and maneuver. What we lack is agreed rules of the road and a centralized or coordinated approach to managing traffic. Encouragingly, there are efforts on the way. The EU has launched already its own STM initiative. At the UN COPWAS, as mentioned, there are ongoing dialogues about what an international STM regime might look like. Some advocate for an ICAO-like entity for space. Others prefer a network of networks approach where data is shared but control remains distributed. The industry should push for progress here. Effective STM will protect your investments and ensure you can continue to operate safely. It also aligns with the principle of space sustainability, using space in a way that is viable long-term and doesn't harm future users. For ground segment professionals, improved STM could mean receiving standardized collision warnings, having protocols to respond, and tools integrated into our control systems for automatic maneuver planning. We have covered a broad terrain, from regulatory modernization and standards to spectrum, new technologies, security, and orbital sustainability. It is clear that satellite ground segment of 2025 and beyond will not be business as usual. We are navigating an inflection point where all paradigms are shifting. What then is our pathway forward? In my view, it comes down to proactive adaptation and collaboration. We must update our frameworks and not cling to legacy rules or models that no longer serve us. Whether that means lobbying for regulatory change, investing in new standards, or revamping internal practices. We must innovate relentlessly in our ground technology, virtualization, cloud orchestration, AI for network management, and more, to handle the scale and complexity of the upcoming networks. At the same time, we have to uphold core principles, ensuring the benefits of space reach all people, sharing finite resources fairly, and doing our part to maintain the spectral commons. Crucially, no single entity can achieve this pathway alone. It requires a concerted effort across industry, government, and international institutions. I often think that satellite ecosystem is a perfect illustration of the need for unity, a chain of ground stations, satellites, launch providers, service providers, and end users, all interconnected. Any weak link, an outdated law, a non-interoperable interface, a congested frequency, or a security gap can undermine the whole. Conversely, when we work in concert, the results are extraordinary. In practical terms, let's set some collective goals for the next few years. By 2030, let it be said that our industry modernized the regulatory playing field to accommodate the new space. We standardized key interfaces so ground networks could plug and play at scale. We brought online billions of unconnected, contributing to closing the digital divide. We successfully integrated satellite into global 5G, 6G fabric, unlocking services that people take for granted as part of our networked world. We opened up and mastered new spectral frontiers through ingenuity. We hardened our infrastructure against threats, so much so attempted attacks, though inevitable, are effectively mitigated and system downtime is minimal. And we put in place the foundation of international space traffic management system so that even as space activity tripled, it remained safe and sustainable. This is the future I envision and commit to, and I believe it's within our grasp. Ladies and gentlemen, the ground segment might be on the ground, but it's where the sky is no longer the limit. If we get our strategies right, the satellite ground segment will be launchpad, quite literally, for building a connected, secure, and prosperous tomorrow. Let us work together across disciplines and borders to ensure that tomorrow's infrastructure is built today on solid, forward-looking foundation. Thank you very much.